Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today we are going to continue with our demons and monsters. So let's start. Virgin ghosts and veiled mothers. As you may remember, we were reading about Lamia and everything related to her, all the incantations, etc. And we will continue. Anyway, in 306 BC, as the heirs of Alexander the Great fought over the control of his empire, Ptolemy's first fleet was captured at the Battle of Salamis by the young ruler of Macedon, Demetrius Poliorcetes. Aboard one of Ptolemy's ships was a courtesan by the name of Lamia, who was taken as a concubine by Demetrius. While we have little information regarding how she felt about this, we do know that she quickly became Demetrius's favorite. Not apparently due to her looks, as Plutarch insists on repeating throughout his account of her life. She was already past her prime when she was captured by Demetrius, but because she was witty and prompt in repartee. Lamia was also supposedly demanding and prone to extravagant whims, which were often indulged by a besotted Demetrius. We have multiple accounts of lavish feasts that he held in her honor, and according to Plutarch, he even levied a substantial tax on his citizens to pay for her soap. A curious anecdote about her has also survived concerning a discussion between a group of Demetrius's representatives and a Macedonian officer called Lysimachus. During a lull in a conversation, Lysimachus began showing off the scars on his legs and back, souvenirs from a time he had fought a lion. Demetrius's man laughed and claimed that their king too had scars on his neck from a dreadful white beast, Lamia. Somebody was feisty. This was not just a reference to Lamia's allegedly controlling nature, but also a pun. The king's lover shared her name with a mythical monster. This monstrous Lamia was said to have been a beautiful queen of Libya who was loved by Zeus and forced by an envious Hera to devour her own children. Driven by mad grief and guilt, Lamia turned into a demonic creature, Serpentine, terrifying and vengeful. She spent her time slaughtering mothers and eating their children, furious that they had what she had lost, ripping open the wombs of pregnant women to devour the fetus inside. And if that sounds familiar, it's because this monster was the Greek and Roman equivalent of Lamia, a direct descendant of the Mesopotamian child and mother-killing demon. Given this, Lamia might seem like a strange name for a courtesan, but although Lamia had never made any pretense at sexiness, Lamia was not just a child killer. She was also given to seducing handsome young men, concealing her monstrous features so as to appear a great beauty, before eating men alive once their guard was down. Her name was perfect for a prostitute who, according to Plutarch, had utterly vanquished her royal lover. The mythical Lamia, like her Mesopotamian counterpart, still gives us deep insight into the tragedies of infant and maternal mortality and the desperation to which women struggled against these horrors. But she was another side as well. She shows us how womanhood and femininity could be policed. Policed? In every way, the monstrous Lamia stood opposed to the Greek and Roman ideals of womanhood. Where a good woman should be a mother, Lamia murdered children and prevented pregnancies. Where a woman should be a chaste wife, Lamia was unmarried and seductive. Where a woman should be beautiful, Lamia was hideous, albeit able to appear attractive when she needed to. Where a woman should be submissive and meek to men, Lamia manipulated and murdered them. In some cases, Lamia is given testicles and a phallus, a way of emphasizing in Greek and Roman eyes how completely she was the antithesis of the supposed ideal of femininity. A courtesan, Lamia was breaking the standards of womanhood in similar, albeit less dramatic, ways. She too was the opposite of the chaste wife and mother. She was seductive, unmarried, argumentative, past her prime, dominating her man as opposed to being dominated by him, refusing to conform to the societal standards by which women were judged. The constant comparisons between the real-life Lamia and her mythical namesake make it clear that these characteristics did not just make the courtesan unconventional. In the eyes of some, they made her monstrous. And while comparison between a woman and the monster who shared her name might seem fair enough, Lamia would eventually become a more general insult thrown at any woman who was deemed insufficiently feminine. A tool for literally demonizing those who dare to break with the ideal of womanhood. Before digging any deeper into her lore, it's important to consider how Lamia was related to Lamashtu, or even whether she was related at all. In the West, we are used to thinking of civilization as beginning in ancient Greece. With the thousands of years of Middle Eastern history, of writing, cities, great epics, complex and enormous trade network, art, science, and mathematics, relegated to a faintly barbaric prelude. This perception is not helped by the fact that the contact points between East and West that tend to be emphasized by both sides are the wars. Whether it's the conquests of Alexander the Great or the Battle of Thermopylae. Okay, first time I hear that. There are no Zack Snyder films or ancient epics about the time a nice Greek family migrated to Asia and slowly integrated with the local population, or the connections between a Roman businessman and his trading partner in Phoenicia, even though these sorts of relationships were just as characteristic of the thousands of years of contacts between the East and West as the moment of conflict. But no matter what modern and ancient media might have you thinking, cultural crossover between Greece, Rome, and the Middle East was inevitable. They traded with each other, lived with each other, immigrated, and intermixed. And we have plenty of clear examples of cultural borrowing with most of the influence passing from east to west. Greek and Roman statuary, literature, and art all owed a debt to ancient Mesopotamia. Even Greek gods are tied to the Mesopotamian pantheon. Plenty of aspects of the goddess Aphrodite, for example, are derived from the Mesopotamian Ishtar, by way of the Phoenician Astarte? Okay. It's not surprising that a demoness as important as Lamashtu crossed over too, and her appearance in Greece and Rome should be no more unexpected than her turning in a Levant or Anatolia. The connections between Lamashtu and Lamia were clear in Lamia's name, in her habit of murdering infants and their mothers, in her associations with snakes. Even the sagging breasts, Lamia is sometimes portrayed with look distinctly Lamashtu-like. Her origin was also placed in the Middle East by the ancient Greeks themselves, who claimed she came from Libya. Each one of these attributes taken by itself is not enough to demonstrate a connection, but looked at together of evidence seems clear. In fact, the most marked difference between Lamia and Lamashtu is the nature and extent of sources that reference them. Compared to the gigantic incantation series and extensive amulet collections relating to Lamashtu, Lamia-related sources from ancient Greece and Rome might, at first glance, look a little thin on the ground. We have no Lamia amulets, and the written sources amount to the handful of texts, the longest of which is barely more than a paragraph. Based on this, it might seem like Lamia wasn't a very important monster, certainly when compared to Lamashtu. However, when Lamia does appear, it's often in context that suggests she was known more widely than it might initially seem. There seems to be an assumption on the part of writers that their audience were well aware of who Lamia was and would understand passing references to her. It wasn't just the joking representatives of Demetrius who did this. Horace, for example, in his Ars Poetica, cautions that when telling a story you should not draw a live boy out of Lamia's belly. That is, you must not make a plot too fantastical, and never thinks to explain who Lamia is, or why she'd be eating children. Unfortunately, why these sorts of sources show that belief in, or at least knowledge of, Lamia was widespread in ancient Greece and Rome, they make it much harder to understand her. Where knowledge is assumed, it isn't given, and we are left with a lot of gaps in our Lamia lore. Especially frustrating is the fact that we can't tell whether belief in her was different between ancient Greece and ancient Rome. She appears in sources from both, or even how belief in her changed through time. However, there is still plenty that we can see, and most of it is related to snakes, eating children, and murdering mothers. The most matter-of-fact description of Lamia comes from Darius of Samos, a tyrant of the city of Samos in the 3rd century BC, who moonlighted as a historian and literacy critic in his spare time. He writes, Lamia was a beautiful woman in Libya. Zeus had sex with her. Because of Hera's envy towards her, she destroyed the children she bore. Consequently, she became misshapen through grief, snatched other people's children, and killed them. This is all pleasantly straightforward and clear, if a little stilted. The only part Dorius is vague on is exactly how Lamia was misshapen. But we don't have to look far to find out. Most accounts make Lamia at least partially serpentine, a monstrousness brought on by her horror at what she has lost, or what she has done. In one account she is called a snake by her foes, in others she has given a serpent's tail instead of legs. There is even a story where she is a child-eating monster with a scaly gait and a single snake growing from her forehead. This particular Lamia was not a once beautiful queen. Instead, she was sent by Apollo to punish the Argives for causing the death of Apollo's lover Samanthe and their children. Lamia here is described as a monster conceived in the deepest part of the Acheron, in the Furies' unspeakable holes. The monster had the face and breasts of a girl, but from her head there rose a snake, hissing continuously, parting her ruddy forehead. Then this dread blight slid into rooms by night with a scaly gait, snatched newborn souls from the bosoms of their nurses, devoured them with bloody bite, and grew fat on the grief of the land. A woman with a snake growing from her forehead might sound reminiscent of the snake-haired Medusa, but oddly enough, Medusa was never connected with Lamia. Lamia was, however, linked with another serpentine monster. In some stories, she is the mother of Scylla, a creature with 6 snake-like heads growing out of her torso, who lived by the sea and menaced Odysseus, murdering 6 of his crew members, one of each with her snake, one for each of her snakes. As he sailed by Scylla is especially similar to the iteration of Lamia described by Dio Chrysostom, a philosopher writing in the 1st century AD. This Lamia is not a single monster, but a backstory, but a species of creatures with an upper half of a beautiful woman and the tail of a snake. According to Dio, these creatures lived by the sea in Libya, waiting to tempt in shipwrecked sailors and eat them alive. All of this seagoing and sailors devouring may be why Aristotle refers to Lamia as a type of shark. And it's important as well to notice how preeminent the sea is in these Lamia legends. This oceanic facet of her myth would have a long afterlife. Lamia is the mother of our mermaids. While snakyless and child killing don't appear in every single iterations of the Lamia, the snake women of Dio Chrysostom don't kill children, and Durius of Samos's description as a child killer doesn't especially mention snakes. They are by far her most preeminent characteristics, and it's rare to find an account of her without one or the other. Whether other characteristics do appear, where Lamia seems wolf-like rather than serpentine, or goat-legged rather than snake-tailed, is often because she was blending with a host of other Greek and Roman monsters, who brought their myths to tangle with Lamia's own. Eventually, as with Lilitu and Lamashtu, these monsters became other aspects of Lamia, their names and legends interchangeable, a process we can already see beginning in antiquity. In the life of Apollonium of Tyana, written in the 2nd century AD, the hero is confronted by Lamia and identifies her as one of the Empousa, who most people would call Lamia or Mormo. Here are 3 names for one creature, but Empousa and Mormo were not just alternative designations for Lamia. They were, or at least they could be, entirely separate monsters. Of these 2 names here, the Empousa is the easiest to deal with, simply because we know the least about her. Grades of Malus, a philosopher of the 2nd century BC, mentions her in passing as having the ability to shape-shift, something that is supported in our second source for her, a comedy written by the ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes. In The Frogs, a slave plays a practical joke on his master and pretends to see an Empousa. As his master covers, too terrified to look himself, the slave claims to be watching the Empousa turn into a donkey, a beautiful woman, a bull, and then a dog, while also assuring his master that in her true form she has 1 leg of brass and 1 leg of dung. The Empousa is certainly related to a modern Greek Lamia attested in the 1980s AD, who was said to have a leg of brass and a donkey leg, and possibly even to the medieval tradition of beautiful women who concealed monstrous legs beneath their skirts. But the ancient sources concerning her are so limited that it's impossible to see where the crossover between Lamia and Empousa came, or why they blended into each other. Perhaps it was simply that both monsters could shape-shift and could appear as beautiful women while hiding more bestial attributes. This is rather thin pickings, and we can be fairly certain we are missing huge portions of Empousa lore that might have given us a deeper understanding of her connection to Lamia. Thankfully, we have significantly more information concerning the other monster named in the life of Apollonium, the Mormo or Mormo. In the 3rd century BC, the 19-year-old poet Irina composed her masterwork, a 300-line hexameter poem called the Distaff. From the 50-odd lines that survive, we can see that it was written as a memorial to her friend Baucis, or Baucis, who had died young, almost immediately after her marriage. Irina portrays this as a double grief, first losing her friend and possibly her lover to a man's bed, and then almost immediately afterwards to death. It's a heart-wrenching poem. Irina's sorrow feels naked and real, torn between grief and anger, furious at her friend for abandoning her twice over in such quick succession, but also heartbroken at her loss. Most of the surviving lines consists of Irina reminiscing about her idyllic childhood with Baucis, and among nostalgia for their old games, she mentions what terror the monster Mormo brought when we were both little girls. On her head were massive ears, and she walked on 4 feet and kept changing her face. It's clear from this that Mormo was like Empousa and Lamia, could shapeshift, and she kept changing her face. But Irina implies that Mormo's primary form is of a quadruped with big ears. This is generally interpreted as a wolfish form, since Mormo is related to wolves elsewhere. Often, as in the life of Apollonium, her name is even extended to Mormolykeia, which means a terrible wolf. Mormo means simply terrible one. We can also see from Irina's poem that Mormo, like Lamia, was a child snatcher. She was terrifying to Irina and Baucis when they were little girls. This child killing is attested elsewhere as well. The Greek geographer Strabo claimed Mormo and Lamia were used as frightful tales to discourage bad behavior in children. And in Theocritus's Ideal, a collection of pastoral poems written in the 4th century BC, when a child starts whining that he can't go to a festival with his mother, the mother responds, "I will not make you go with me, child." Mormo, the horse, bites, at which point the child bursts into tears. It's confusing that Theocritus has Mormo as a horse and not a wolf, but perhaps this is another sign of her shape-shifting abilities. And while no other sources refer to her as a horse, and her latter incarnations are all snake and wolf based, it's interesting that the description of Mormo in the distaff could technically apply to a horse as well as a wolf. Perhaps Irina was keeping the shape of her Mormo intentionally vague, allowing her to shape-shift in the poem as well. There is no suggestion in any of these sources that Mormo has a specific Lamia-like backstory, but we do have one late reference to Mormo that makes her a once human woman turned murderously demonic. This comes from a scholia, an explanatory comment written by a later scholar to the work of Aristides, a Greek orator of the 2nd century BC. Like most, scholia is plentifully difficult to date, but it was likely Hellenistic or Byzantine. It reads, "When Aristides writes about the things that terrify children when they hear them, he refers to Mormo and Lamia. Mormo was a Corinthian woman. She devoured her own children and then in the evening flew up into the sky for some reason. So now when women want to scare their children, they shout Mormo to the sky." This is a grim, odd little story. Mormo acts without any provocation, an ordinary Corinthian woman suddenly turning monstrous. The author's own comment that this was, for some reason, an almost sarcastically lackluster approach to understanding her motivations. However, the oddness is likely because the story is simply a retelling of Lamia's legend, with the specific details of Zeus's love and Hera's jealousy removed, leaving no reason for the shift from human woman to demon Given that this variant of the story is never referenced outside of the single case, it is also unlikely that it was particularly well known. Perhaps it was even invented by the scholar who wrote it. Despite the many similarities between Lamia and Mormo, we have no sources that reference Mormo killing mothers as well as infants. However, there are hints in the distaff that girls were not safe from her even when they reached adolescence. The death of Baucius is a tragedy not just because she was beloved by Irina, but because she was young and died on the cusp of adulthood almost immediately after she was married. The suddenness of her death, the horror that it came so soon after her wedding, is emphasized in the epitaph that Irina wrote for Baucius alongside the poem, which reads, "I am the tomb of Baucius, a young bride, and as you pass the much lamented gravestone, you may say to Hades, Hades, you are malicious. When you look, the beautiful letters will tell of the most cruel fate of Baucius, how her father-in-law lit the girl's funeral pyre with the pine torches over which Hymen sang. Hymen? And you, Hymen, changed the tuneful song of weddings into the mournful song of lamentations." We know of another Greek monster who attacked and killed girls just like Baucius, murdering young women before or just after marriage, a monster who was also connected to Lamia and Mormo to the extent that their names would, in some circumstances, become synonymous. It's possible that even Irina brought Mormo into her poem about a girl who died almost immediately after her wedding. She meant to recall a monster called Gallo, or Jello. Gallo. Let's call her Gallo. Gello. In ancient Greece, and to a lesser extent Rome, there was a deep-seated interest in and anxiety about young girls like Baucius who died before they could marry or have children. We have dozens of epitaphs like the one Irina wrote about Baucius. Concise little laments filled with longing for what might have been and the lives these girls might have led. This dust of Timaeus stuck down before she could wed. Persephone's dark bridal hole received her. When she died, her girlfriends all sharpened blades and sheeted their gorgeous hair. I never completed the rite of the bridal chamber and bed, nor did my body lie on the couch, nor was there an all-night knocking by the girls my age on the cedar doors. I wonder what that could mean. I, Lento, died a virgin. I was like a young flower at the time of high bloom when it first shone its petals. And at 15, when I was about to be untied in a marriage, I went to lie among the dead in a long sleep. Girls who died in this way, unfulfilled virgins on the brink of womanhood, were not just unlucky in life. In death, they were denied entry to the underworld, forced to linger at the gates of Hades, or wander for eternity with the Furies. As if we needed more drama into the Greek mythology, we now have this lovely instance. Very good. These girls, often called aorai, a word which means prematurely dead, were even used in since they could move between the upper and lower worlds. Having been unable to fully live, they were likewise unable to fully die. My gosh, people, just because they did not have sex doesn't mean that they did not fully live. Oh my goodness. The misogyny. These virgin ghosts were sad, wistful creatures, but they could also be viciously dangerous. Gallo in particular. Gallo, like all Auri, was the ghost of a girl who had died before marriage and children. Because of course, all that women can do is get married and have children. The end. Much like Lamia, she could be portrayed as either a single creature or a whole race of virgin ghosts, and spend her afterlife murdering infants and their mothers out of jealousy, of course. She was also blamed for the deaths of other young girls like her and like Baucis. This is laid out by a proverb compiler called Zenobius, who lived in Rome in the 2nd century AD and described Gallo as a maiden, and because she died prematurely, the people of Lesbos say that her ghost haunts little children, and they also blame her for the deaths of those who died prematurely. Let's blame everything on someone. Gallo then was a prematurely dead girl, causing the premature deaths of other girls. A hideous warped form of reproduction, whereby instead of having the children she so wanted, Gallo turned other hopeful girls into twatted, jealous monsters like herself. The reason Zenobius was talking about Gallo in the first place, and the reason he associated her with Lesbos, was because he was commenting on a fragment from an otherwise lost poem by Sappho, which reads, more child-loving than Gallo. A dark little turn of phrase that perfectly encapsulates Gallo's nature. She steals children because she loves them desperately, violently, possessively. Although Gallo is much more distinct from Lamia than Empousa and Mormo, it's easy to see how and why they run together. In spells found in the Sironides, a collection of magical lore compiled in the 4th century AD but likely using earlier material, Gallo is described as a thing that strangles the infant and persecutes the woman in the childbed. A description that could easily apply to Lamia herself. One list of magical stones from the Hellenistic period advises that stones be hung around the necks of newborns to drive away Megaira, she who is envious. Without any further information, this could apply to either the furiously jealous Lamia or Gallo. Perhaps it was kept intentionally vague so it could protect against both at once. The connection between the two was often made entirely explicit. Writing to Theocritus, a scholiast, who, like all scholiasts, is difficult to date, but was likely working in the Hellenistic or Byzantine eras, even describes Mormo, Lamia, and Gallo as one single being. This could explain how and why Mormo came to feature in Irina's poem, with Baucis dead recalling the loss of girls like her to these jealous, monstrous killers, something for girls to be afraid of both as children and as budding women. However, the connections between Gallo and Lamia are often thought to run even deeper than their shared monstrous envy for young women and their children. It has been suggested that Gallo, like Lamia, had her origins in Mesopotamia in the ghostly, jealous Lilitu. With all the virginal ghostly child-killing, the similarities between Gallo and Lilitu are immediately striking, but the difference in their names would give anyone pause when connecting the two monsters. Even the most creative linguists would have difficulties suggesting that Lilitu could become Gallo. It is, however, possible that this name shift was caused by another Mesopotamian demon called a Gallo. We know relatively little about Gallo demons, but they seem to have been responsible for taking human souls to the underworld. It's said of them in one myth that they know no food, know no drink, eat no flower offering, drink no libation. They never enjoy the pleasures of marital embrace, never have any sweet children to kiss. They snatch the son from a man's knee. They make the bride leave the house of her father-in-law. Okay. If you squint a lot, this does look a little Lilitu-like, with all the missing marital embraces and murdered brides and sons. If you really try, you could see a world in which the two demons were confused, especially by the ancient Greeks, who were often quite free and easy with Mesopotamian names. Whatever. It's also worth pointing out that in the canonical incantation series of Lamashtu, the Gallo demons is mentioned, and that Gallo, like Lamashtu, is often connected to strangulation. A final point in favor of the Mesopotamian transmission is that the name Gallo has no sensible etymology in ancient Greek. It does contain gal, to grin, something which Greek monsters certainly did in a leering, hideous way, but which the virgin ghost is never described as doing herself. So sad. She is just so sad to be virgin. On the other hand, there is the rather damning fact that Gallo in Mesopotamia was male and is never particularly associated with murdering mothers or their children. Moreover, the Greek and Roman Gallo lacks one of Lilitu's most preeminent characteristics. She has no interest at all in man and never seduces anyone. Even when she has blended with Lamia, to the extent that their names can at times be used interchangeably, all the sexual elements are Lamia's alone. However, whatever Gallo's origins, her eventual merging with Lamia would bring plenty of Mesopotamian influence of its own. Just like Lamashtu and Lilitu, Lamia and Gallo, or Empousa and Mormo, give flashes of insight into the lives of women in antiquity. These creatures inhabited an almost entirely female world, and through them we can get glimpses of a side of history that's often obscured by important men and their important achievements. From a mother crossly threatening her child with a monster unless he behaves, to a little girl playing games, and women cutting their hair in joint mourning for a friend. It's no surprise that two of our most significant sources for these monsters came from Irina and Sappho, two of the greatest female poets in antiquity. Lamia and Gallo especially emphasize of the most painful aspects of infertility and child loss. Overwhelming jealousy towards other women who are able to have children. This is especially evident in the account of Lamia recorded in Diodorus Siculus' enormous library of history, an attempt at a universal history of the world, written in about 16 BC and filling an impressive 40 books. They say that this cave is where Queen Lamia was born, who was outstanding in her beauty. The passage of time thereafter rendered her appearance bestial because of the wildness of her nature. For all the children that were born to her died. She was crushed by her suffering and came to envy the fertility of other women. So she commanded her men to snatch babies from their mother's embrace and kill them at once. And so it is that still now, in our own age, the story about this woman is kept alive with children, and her mere name is terrifying to them. This is a rationalizing account, an attempt to explain away this supernatural myth by giving it a supposed real-world grounding in history. And it's notable that while Diodorus left out the gods and snake monsters to make it more believable, he felt a woman crippled by jealousy after the loss of her children and committing terrible acts because of it was plausible. His Lamia is almost sympathetic, a woman crushed by suffering at the deaths of her children and driven to do terrible things. The jealousy displayed by Lamia and Gallo is another aspect of the pain that women felt and feel when they lose their child or struggle with infertility, another side of the pain of infant death, or the inability to have a much-wanted child. Even today, pregnancy envy is an acknowledged side effect of child loss, miscarriage, and infertility, to the extent that NHS and infertility counselors report it as a common issue. Some women report that their jealousy is so overwhelming they cannot be around pregnant friends or children. Some even have said that they will cross the road when they see a pregnant woman, so painful is the envy it provokes. In a time when infant mortality was vastly about what it is today, when there were no IVF or infertility treatments, the jealousy of seeing women with living, healthy children after suffering a loss must have been a pain that many women knew, reflected in an envious, murderous impulses of Lamia and Gallo. It is also clear from these monsters that the loss of a child, or the inability to have one in the first place, was not thought of solely as the personal tragedy for a woman. It was a failure of her womanhood. Lamia and Gallo may be sympathetic, but they are monstrous nonetheless. Lamia is fundamentally a woman who is unable to keep her children alive, and while there might be understanding of the pain this causes her, she is nonetheless demonized for it. Gallo, meanwhile, is tormented not just because she died young, but because she never married or had children. There is no suggestion that her lost life could have taken a different path. She is not driven to furious murder because, had she lived, she could have composed great poetry or written works of philosophy or become an athlete. The failure is to marry or have children, or to keep existing children alive. Turn Lamia or Gallo from beautiful young women into monsters, demons who were entirely outside of civilized society. they have failed at being women to such an extent that they were women no longer. Okay, I think that this is a good point to stop. I think that, again, very informative, continuing on what we have read before, and again, also a reflection of on how womanhood and women as beings in general were perceived at these times. Anyway, I don't want to dive too deep into that, but I am glad that I'm able to read it and find the context in it right now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and again, thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next time.